Punk as a movement, for me, was very much a personal and artistic genre.
Malcolm McLaren was not, by any measurable standard, a good man. He left a trail of wreckage everywhere he went, birth until death, channeling his sense of dysfunction into one of the most potent subcultures in modern history.
You know, he created chaos and caused as much mayhem, as much carnage as possible. He was a dreaming, scheming kind of pop Svengali.
He's wacky. He likes to take things and really upset things.
The godfather of punk didn't just embrace chaos, he made it fashionable.
Popularity of punk rock was, in effect, due to the fact that it made ugliness beautiful. The nihilism all led to an anti-design, anti-fashion, anti-social, anti-establishment, a we hate everything vibe that became immensely and immeasurably attractive.
The seeds of the McLaren descent were sown early. He and his parents lived in North London with grandmother Rose, an eclectic woman from a wealthy family of Portuguese Sephardic Jews.
She hated art, thought it was a silly, stupid game. What are people doing messing around with crayons for? So I just thought it was an absolutely ridiculous thing, and so I was definitely not given crayons to draw with like any other kid. No, I was given Victorian literature on one knee and a dictionary on another, and I had to get on with it for hours on end.
McLaren's mother had wed for money and found herself trapped in a loveless marriage with a child she held little affection for. It was, ironically, the mirror life of her mother. Rose had been forced into an unhappy marriage, rearing a child she didn't really like, in the words of her grandson. The lineage of irony was never lost on McLaren. To be honest, I don't blame her. I never liked my mother either. McLaren's mother drifted in and out of his youth, more interested in chasing men — it was rumoured she was a prostitute — than she was in caring for her child. Child-rearing duties were left in the hands of Rose, who had already paid her son-in-law a handsome fee to abandon his wife and child. Not that this seemed to bother McLaren. He idolised his grandmother and her fractured sense of morality, an ethos underpinned with a singular message that would eventually form the basis of punk rock.
She said when I would wander out, patting me on my head, "You know, Malcolm, to be bad is good, because to be good is simply boring."
My grandmother taught me from a very early age to disregard anybody with an air of authority. School became the first proving ground of this anarchistic attitude, spitting in the face of authority, yet secure in the knowledge that his grandmother would protect him when true consequence arose.
Often getting into all kinds of trouble, my grandmother would linger and be brought to order by the headmistress or the head teacher. And as far as she was concerned, whenever I got into trouble, she would just holler the words, "Boys will be boys," and continue to hope that I would continue to wreak damage and chaos in that school forever after. My grandmother gave me 2 pieces of cotton wool to put in my ears if I didn't want to suffer the garbage, she said, that may be spoken to you on a daily rationing of by any teacher. And if they really got on your nerves, just turn to the wall, it'll be more interesting. Turn your face to the wall. She said, they'll probably have on the wall some ridiculous map of the world. Most of the countries will be coloured pink, and they will gloat over the fact that they own it all. Well, they don't. And very soon they'll own nothing except these few sordid miles in this muddy hole called London.
His rebellion of authority never seemed to extend to Rose, however, who held an almost cult-like influence on McLaren. Forbidden to associate with girls and sharing a bed with his grandmother until he was 14, McLaren was a rebel only under the strangest and strictest of supervision. By the time McLaren entered art school, chaos was the dominant force in his life. He was ejected from every school he attended. One went as far as to try and have him committed into a mental institution. And yet, along with his grandmother, McLaren saw his time in art school as a formative experience in his contribution to punk. It was here he became obsessed with the French Situationists, a cultural movement promoting absurd and provocative actions as a means of social change.
He said, well, because, you know, you can't just fail. You got to learn how to become a magnificent failure, the most brilliant failure, because it's better to be a flamboyant failure than any kind of benign success. Those words rang in my ears, and it was prophetic and difficult for an 18-year-old to understand. But eventually, I did understand it. I understood it very well, because what he was actually trying to say was the only way you were ever going to change life. By changing the culture, you had to learn how to be fearless. You had to learn how to never listen to the rules. You had to create your own world, your anti-world. And don't ever think you can ever arrive anywhere, because success means death.
The circumstances of their relationship differ depending on the source you choose to believe, Maclaren or Westwood. Maclaren met Westwood through her brother, who was studying at art school with Maclaren at the time. Westwood, 6 years older than Maclaren, claims he took an interest in her jewellery making skills and relentlessly pursued the 25-year-old until she eventually conceded to have sex with him out of pity. By his own admission, Maclaren found Westwood supremely annoying. She held culture on a pedestal while I was always trying to knock it down, and yet there was a clear chemistry between the two. Westwood had been trying to escape a mundane existence as a primary school teacher at the time, and was fascinated with the radical ideals that Maclaren would espouse. As for Maclaren, testosterone meant I couldn't help but be attracted to her body. I found myself in bed with her one night and lost my virginity to her, and suddenly she handed me the bill. The bill, as Maclaren so charmingly put it, was pregnancy. Maclaren was completely unwilling to raise a child, and once again turned to his grandmother for help abandoning consequence. Rose provided the money necessary for Westwood to have an abortion. But on the way to the appointment, she had a change of heart, electing to spend it on a cashmere twin set instead. Maclaren admired her lack of cooperation, but refused to be drawn into the responsibilities of fatherhood. I was lost in that terrain. I'd been brought up to destroy families. But for the first few years, Maclaren and Westwood attempted to raise a child in a conventional setting. It didn't last. By 1971, Maclaren had run out of art schools to attend and sank into depression. To cheer himself up, he began construction on a blue lame suit and had Westwood assist him. It was then he realised that the mother of his child was a gifted seamstress.
And he was very, very keen on this situationist slogan about autonomy for kids. And nearly every fabric that's produced in England has got a kind of emotional charge.
If you were to ask me how much did Vivienne and Malcolm need each other, I think they needed each other a lot, because I think Vivienne was always the person who came up with the designs, the cut of the fabrics, the look, what materials to use. And I know Malcolm really did sort of think about what to do, but for me it's always been her side of it. I think the two of them needed each other, but for me, I think the creativity came more from Vivienne. But Malcolm was creative in his own way. I mean, it's like Warhol in a way to me. He'd actually use other people and us to sort of like, for his own creation, his own artwork.
Maclaren was proving himself a shrewd promoter. Each directional change drove the boutique to greater heights of success. Leaving behind school for good, Maclaren and Westwood opened a boutique along the now famous King's Road in Chelsea.
The one thing that would draw us to the King's Road was Vivienne and Malcolm's shop. That was one thing you had to go and see and hang out in.
The boutique would undergo several transformations under the watchful eye of McLaren, but originally it was named Let It Rock, selling the rockabilly aesthetic of draped jackets, drainpipe trousers, and brothel creeper shoes, a style popularised by the teddy boy subculture at the time.
I think anyone who went to the King's Road, to Malcolm and Vivienne's store, Let It Rock, when they saw the clothes, and I was one of those, I had to have them. Yes, they were very expensive, but I still bought them.
By 1973, the store had been renamed Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, and shifted from rockabilly to the greaser fashions popularised in the 1950s.
I sort of transformed into another shop when the Teddy Boys became less interested in the sort of the new clothes he was wearing. They were all wanting to wear the vintage clothing, but Malcolm actually wanted to sort of move it on. And with Vivienne, who he got to know at that time, who is I think, more on the design side of things, that's why they opened Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die.
After reinventing all this rock and roll culture from the ruins of the past, in 1970s, searching for things that were happening in the 50s, I became bored. I thought I was part of some nostalgia movement. And nostalgia is, for me, dead tissue.
It wasn't until 1974 that McLaren injected his personal mantra of dysfunction into the store and cemented his legacy as the man who brought punk to the masses. The origins of the punk rock movement began in New York. McLaren and Westwood had been making periodic trips there since the early 1970s, exhibiting their clothes and strengthening their connection to the New York underground. McLaren in particular had become fascinated with the anarchistic principles and radical fashion of the proto-punk movement, forming relationships with trailblazing bands like the New York Dolls and Richard Hell of Television. In the spring of 1974, he brought punk rock back to the UK, rebranding the boutique Sex and stocking the store with the bondage gear and socially provocative garments that would eventually become synonymous with punk culture.
All the changing of the facades and all the different aspects of fashion on the King's Road that me and Vivienne created for such a period and length of time became the dominant cultural point. Fashion, its power lies in its extraordinary ability to provide an identity.
I wanted to do something new. I wanted to do something as demonstrative and as powerful, but something new. So I reopened my shop. Originally, it was called Let It Rock, after a Chuck Berry song, or Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, the sort of thing that would be painted on the back of Hell's Angels jackets, into a shop that I decided to call Sex.
Shortly after the inception of Sex, McLaren returned to the United States. It was there he met with the New York Dolls guitarist Sylvain Sylvain and agreed to become their personal manager. Together they conspired on a new direction for the band, one that adopted the shock tactics of communism, outfits inspired by the Maoist Red Guard and a host of socialist propaganda littering the stage. Like so much of what McLaren did, the new look was designed to spark outrage. Instead, it simply caused confusion. The directional change proved the final nail in the coffin for the outfit, and they disbanded not long after. Undeterred by his failure at the helm of the Dolls, McLaren returned home with the goal of starting a new band, one he could use as mannequins to sell the fashion of punk. He already had the perfect candidates, Musician Steve Jones had approached McLaren prior to his time with the Dolls about managing his band The Strand, even convincing McLaren to pay for their rehearsal space. Upon his return to the UK, McLaren set about moulding the band into his own personal image. Musical talent was not a prerequisite for inclusion. Only those with the appropriate image needed apply.
One stroppy kid came in the store, desperate to buy a pair of shoes. And I just had a sort of hunch. I looked at him and I sort of asked him if he could sing. Looked at me as if I was totally mad and said, no. And I thought, well, can you play something, maybe? And he said, I can play the violin, but out of tune. I thought he was a total perfect. I thought, I've got to hire this guy.
We met at the Malcolm shop on King's Road.
And they wanted me to go back to the shop and sing to the jukebox.
Paul Cook, and I think the bass player, the Saturday boy at that time, Glenn, stood back by the jukebox as we all watched John perform.
He sang along to the jukebox in an arrogant way, you know, just taking the piss. And I thought he wasn't being serious.
He didn't really sing, he just sort of took the piss out of it because it was a bit of an odd scenario to be in, you know.
He began to look like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. He pulled out his handkerchief, he blew his nose. He was spitting and coughing and talking about sex in the grass is free, I don't know what. He was trying to imitate Scream Along, and he was somewhat embarrassed and vulnerable and strange, and I laughed. I thought it was really funny. I thought it was brilliant.
He was being who John was.
Lyndon was angry, offensive, and utterly malleable. Lyndon was rebranded Johnny Rotten, and along with the other band members, draped head to toe in punk garments conceptualised by McLaren and designed by Westwood.
Punks have multicoloured hair, vampire makeup, ripped t-shirts held together with safety pins, swastika armbands, pink plastic trousers and tight leather jeans. You can't buy this sort of gear in Marks and Sparks, so you have to go to shops like Sex in the King's Road.
Malcolm's genius was actually getting the band to wear Vivian's clothes in the shop, so therefore people would see them when they wore them at gigs and think, oh, where did they get that? And then go and buy them.
Later on, I found some of the new generation who wanted to actually express that image on stage, and they called them the Sex Pistols.
I am an anti-coaster. I am an anarcho-coaster. Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy passerby, 'cause I wanna be anarchy.
McLaren always asserted he was in the business of mismanagement.
I was far too demented to be a manager. I would be a brilliant mismanager. I could create chaos.
But under his guidance, the Sex Pistols became the biggest and perhaps most influential punk band in the world, all in the space of 3 years.
There's this incredible myth that dominates the industry about me as being this super kind of Fagin-esque, mythical, sort of charlatan. It's just nonsense. I think it was all a posture that they actually believed. You know, maybe I was just a fine actor, but ultimately, you know, one continually mismanaged things because it just was more attractive to mismanage than manage.
The Sex Pistols were predicated on dysfunction, just like their manager. Chaos fueled their quick rise to infamy, even as it set fire to the foundations of the band. Behind it all was McLaren, orchestrating events that promoted the label of punk to the world, regardless of personal cost.
Malcolm McLaren, you discovered and managed the group. Now, what about the accusation that you're more into chaos than anything else?
Well, that's an accusation by people who really don't understand what kids want. Kids want excitement. They want things that are going to transform what is basically a very boring life for them right now. And music, young rock music, is the only thing they have that they thought that they controlled. And if you look in the charts, they don't really have anything to do with it.
Within a year of forming, the band had their first record contract after generating a devoted following in the punk clubs of London. But after a disastrous television appearance in which a drunk Rotten verbally abused the host, sustained public and political pressure saw their contract revoked. Bad for the band, good for McLaren. Following their television appearance, the Sex Pistols made the front page of every major newspaper. Not only did it promote the culture of punk to the country, it was free advertising for the McLaren and Westwood boutique, now named Seditionaries, and expanding on what punk culture could represent. In fact, when bassist Glenn Matlock was fired for not fitting the image of the band,
Glenn was a little bit more eclectic, kind of like the Beatles and, dare I say, ABBA.
Glenn left the band or was sacked, whatever way you want to look at it, and I think that's what had to happen really for the band to continue.
Malcolm sort of thrives on conflict and things being up in the air and all the time, you know.
They didn't like him. I don't know why just didn't like him. I think he was too nice.
The dynamics, it just seemed a bit off. You know, he was always washing his feet, which we thought was odd, you know. He was always close to his mum and stuff. His mum was offended when we wrote Anarchy in the UK.
McLaren opted for perhaps the single greatest instance of style over substance in rock and roll history. The hiring of Sid Vicious, a stalwart of the punk rock scene and a man with almost no musical proficiency.
Sid had never picked a bass up in his life before, which was a nightmare for me because I'm the one telling him where to put his fingers, you know. But you couldn't deny he had a fantastic look.
Sick on stage, spit at the audience and so on. I mean, how can this be a good example to children?
Well, people are sick everywhere. People are sick and fed up with this country, telling them what to do.
Vicious had been involved in a number of violent assaults, the worst of which had left an innocent girl blinded in one eye.
He just finished his, he had his glass pint pot of beer and just lobbed it.
Which didn't hit me, it hit the pillar in front of my face. And it shattered, and unfortunately, it hurt a lot of people in the audience.
And the result of it shattering, a young girl who was sat on the edge of the stage just beyond lost the sight of one eye, was blinded by a shard of the glass.
And at 19 had already developed a substance abuse problem.
Sid Vicious, who hit drugs in a major way.
After that, it was nothing to do with music anymore, recalled Marco Pironi, who played with Vicious in seminal punk band Susie and the Banshees. It would just be for the sensationalism and scandal of it all. Then it became the Malcolm McLaren story. McLaren secured a second record signing, but the EMI deal fell through after the band stormed the office, destroying property and verbally abusing employees.
I think the real thing when the crack started the show was after we did the Bill Grundy show. That's where we swore on primetime TV, because then it became, prior to that, it was about us being in music magazines and getting a steady, picking up fans. And but when that happened, when we were signed to EMI, we went on there to talk about our little tour that we were going to do, Anarchy in the UK tour. And then when we did the swearing thing, the guy was provoking us. Anyway, we swore. It was the next day. It was just front page tabloid all the way.
When we'd done this TV show, the Bill Grundy show, where I swore on the show, after that we was just total media. And then the music didn't matter anymore. It was just like, what are these bad boys going to do next,
Eric rushed out, I always remember that. Oh no, guy, I'll never work for me again. I'll never work with a boy. The Sex Pistols are finished. Finished the music industry. And that was the end of that.
So he pulled a rug from under your feet, so we weren't that happy about it.
At the time, we weren't going to survive it.
It's almost like it was just killed, sort of just overnight. It was almost like, it was like a revolution within the company. We will not promote or sell this record. So it just sort of stuck there, and it was all it was all over. I mean, that was it. We want the biggest thing. We've got the biggest thing. get rid of the biggest thing within, well, the first single was out for a few weeks, pay them off with £40,000 and goodbye. Just pathetic.
This group really, really, really wanted an album to be made. They felt that was legitimate, and it gave them a legitimacy, made them a real group, if you like. And for the first time, I acted like a responsible manager and made the deal with Virgin.
I was determined to try to sign them to Virgin. Didn't get much support from the rest of the company, but just felt that we'd had that enormous success with Mike Oldfield and Tubular Bells. Just felt that we needed something to shake up the company and move us into a new era. People should be able to express whatever opinions, and God Save the Queen was a strong record. It was maybe a lone voice in Jubilee year, and we felt if they wanted it published, it should be published. So we put the record out. The BBC and the chart company then got together to conspire to keep it at #2, although everybody knew it. It had gone straight in at #1. We discovered that what they were up to, and obviously publicised the fact. It was decided, let's throw a party on the Thames to celebrate the record and celebrate the band. And so we hired a boat.
And I said, well, they can't play on the land and you can't hear them in the air, so let's put them on a bloody boat and let's follow the Queen's flotilla.
It sounds like a joke, but I'm deadly serious. I didn't know it was Jubilee week. I just didn't. And that's from being in the press so often and being slagged and condemned. You give up listening. You don't watch the TV. You don't read the papers. You've no idea. And as per usual, there were no monitors, so I couldn't hear a word or hear anything. Chaos. Good chaos. It was fun letting up the storm outside Parliament. I got arrested for having fun. Amnesty for all except.
That's a fantastic thing. You couldn't buy the record, you couldn't hear the record, you couldn't see the group play, yet the record was unquestionably outselling old Rod Stewart.
And the party was okay, but nothing extraordinary as parties go, until the police, in their wisdom, decided to raid the boat.
The reason you're here is because it's the Sex Pistols. If it wasn't the Sex Pistols, there'd be no interest in this boat tonight.
The band had done nothing wrong, nobody had done anything wrong, but the very act of raiding the boat obviously just propelled the Sex Pistols into the front pages of all the papers, and if it wasn't #1 by then, it was very firmly #1 within a handful of days after the boat trip.
The Sex Pistols' current record, God Save the Queen, is at #1 in the Capital Hitline today, but the IBA, which administers the Broadcasting Act, has advised us that particularly at this time, this record is likely to cause offense to a number of our listeners, and have asked us not to play it in our normal programming.
It was a spectacular piece of anarchy by design that saw McLaren precisely where he wanted to be, in the spotlight. But this time, the wider public were beginning to acknowledge that McLaren was the true force of the Sex Pistols. When a reporter observed to Steve Jones that many people considered the band the brainchild of McLaren,
I thought the group could help me sell them.
He had nothing to do with the music. Nothing at all. He'd come down every now and again, show his face in there, and we'd play music, but I don't think he's a musical person at all.
it was an obvious fiction. Not only had their style been sculpted by the boutique of McLaren and Westwood, but Westwood had been filtering French situationist philosophy through the lyrics of Lyndon since their first single, Anarchy in the UK.
I promise sometime, maybe, after the long time, stomach cramping night, future dreamers and something still.
The band released their first and only album, Nevermind the Bollocks, in 1977.
Our shop in Nottingham, the police raided it and took all the Sex Pistols albums away because it was called Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. And they said that the word bollocks was a derivative of balls. Bollocks is actually not a derivative of balls. It was a nickname given to priests in the 18th century. So the literal meaning of the album is Never mind the priests, here's the Sex Pistols.
I just thought, oh, how boring. If only they'd dragged Branson off to jail, that would be brilliant. I'd go and visit the old hippie.
Maybe I'm just a really bad comedian, but I thought Nevermind the Bollocks was hilarious from start to finish. Pointed, but hilarious, and therefore useful.
Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I wanna destroy, possibly, 'cause I wanna be.
I never had one single possible comment to make other than just make it chaotic.
Despite a number of chain stores refusing to stock the album, it debuted at number 1.
The lyrics were meaningful, they were short, they were delivered quick, and you know, it was totally relevant to that time. In fact, I think it's relevant to the teenagers in any time.
There's no point in asking, you'll get no reply. I'll just stand in, but I don't decide.
The cultural proliferation of punk had reached a zenith, and the mainstream was fighting back. Punk-related violence had skyrocketed in London. A number of people close to the band, including Johnny Rotten, had been viciously assaulted by conservative groups who viewed punk rock as a blight on society.
I upset the bass player because I knew that he knew that I meant physical harm, and I have to say I was ugly about it. But he came out and hit us over the head with a bass. He was hitting us because I was going like this, come on, buddy, and he kept going like this. And I would have been glad to take him on or his buddy Johnny. I don't care either one, and so consequently I was taken out of the concert. I came here to openly cause dissent against the Sex Pistols because I believe negatively in what they're doing.
In front of seditionaries, punks went to war with rockabilly culture, assaulting the teddy boys that McLaren and Westwood catered to only a few short years ago. The chaos of punk had grown beyond control. It was no different inside the Sex Pistols. Vicious had become hopelessly addicted to heroin and splintered allegiances in the band. Rotten had grown increasingly sullen, incensed by continued associations. Both he and the Sex Pistols were little more than marketing tactics designed by McLaren. As his band stood on the precipice of collapse, McLaren used them for a final sensational act of publicity. He organised a tour of America's Deep South, confident their conservative values would clash with the anarchism of his band. The results were beyond imagination. Vicious, completely unhinged on heroin, lived up to his namesake, assaulting several men and women on the first leg of the tour, attacking his own bodyguard, and spitting blood on a woman who stormed the stage to punch him in the face. Rotten had become disgusted with the actions of Vicious, and the farce the band had devolved into, placing the blame on the fallout squarely on McLaren. But then he would turn around and tell Paul and Steve that the tension was all my fault because I wouldn't agree to anything. The band split in January of 1978. McLaren retained the rights to Nevermind the Bollocks, starting an incredibly public spat between Rotten and his former manager that resulted in the band suing for rights to their music, along with $1 million in damages. McLaren continued to work with Westwood following the dissolution of the Sex Pistols, changing the name of the boutique one final time to World's End, and collaborating on their first fashion collection, Pirates, in 1981. Despite her monumental role as a designer of punk fashion, McLaren only ever saw Westwood as his seamstress. But as she embraced her career as a professional designer, it became increasingly clear where the talent for fashion lay in their relationship. Together they created a number of collections under the McLaren and Westwood label, including Savages 1982, Punkature 1982, and Witches 1983. In early 1984, their relationship dissolved, and Westwood, having established herself as a prize designer, struck out on her own to open her own fashion label. Decades after their relationship ended, Westwood spoke of the emotional and physical abuse she endured during their time together. He behaved incredibly cruelly, professionally, personally, in every way. He had this thing where he couldn't leave the flat until he made me cry. He wanted to feel bad or something. He was trying to draw blood. It's a sentiment echoed by their son John Corray, with whom McLaren held a bitter and tumultuous relationship well into adulthood. Corray described McLaren as a horrible bully and said the relationship between his parents was a textbook case of a dysfunctional, toxic thing. And yet McLaren claimed in his final years that the only woman he ever truly loved, apart from his grandmother, was Westwood. Even young Kim, the woman with whom he spent his final 12 years, meant less to him than the shadow of a tormented and fractured relationship with the woman he lost his virginity to. It was a testament to his legacy of familial dysfunction, the comfort he found in disorder, even as it resulted in a broken home and the broken hearts of his partner and child. When McLaren died in 2010 of a rare form of cancer, he left one final twist of the knife through the words of his will. I hereby appoint as my sole heir and executor of my will, Ms. Young Kim. I exclude my son from any inheritance. A devastated Joe challenged the will in court, but failed to overturn the decision, ensuring the dysfunction McLaren so savoured would linger long after his death. And yet, there is poetic justice in the life of McLaren, who found little professional success after separating from Westwood. He managed bands Adamant and Bow Wow Wow, helped to pioneer scratch and hip-hop through hit singles with group Buffalo Girls.
Buffalo girls go around the outside, round the outside, round the outside. For Buffalo girls go around the outside and go your partner.
And I decided I wanted to get out, and the way to get out of this business was for me to become a singer. And I thought, well, you know, once I've done that, that will be it. I won't be allowed back in.
After that, nothing. It should hardly be surprising that a man who embraced chaos and dysfunction could never aspire to anything more than the sum of his parts. Artists must continuously evolve in some form to maintain relevancy. But the core of McLaren's punk rock ethos is the antithesis, more concerned with tearing down than building up or evolving. While contemporaries like Vivienne Westwood have found continued success in their exploration of what punk can represent, a social force for change rather than the battle cry for chaos, McLaren remained myopic for decades, unable to escape a subculture predicated on continued destruction. The man who founded punk rock to get rich, in his own words, left a vicious feud between his family and partner for an estate worth a little over $250,000. By contrast, Vivienne Westwood has a net worth of hundreds of millions of dollars. Even Joe, who endured the most determined and gleeful of absentee parenting, rose to greater heights of success than his father, after founding lingerie brand Agent Provocateur. The son of McLaren and Westwood is worth tens of millions of dollars independently. Still, if his only legacy to the world was marketing punk to mainstream culture, it remains a more important feat than countless billions can claim. Punk is a subculture that will continue to exist for decades. It has become a staple of fashion and culture, an ideology unafraid to stick a thumb in the eye of the established order, shaking the status quo or defying authority for the simple thrill of rebellion. And like all great self-promoters, McLaren knew his genius would only be appreciated after he was gone. As it reads on his headstone, better to be a spectacular failure than a benign success. People are beginning to learn the truth about punk and how instrumental I was in the development of it. That will change the way people will think of me. That will be in the obituaries.
Be childish, be irresponsible, and be everything this society hates. And do it with as much style as possible, and don't fear failure. That was the real message. That was the art. Better to be a flamboyant failure than any kind of benign success.